Fresh and all right, welcome back to another episode of Fresh and Buds. I'm your host, Tommy Fresh. You guys can call me Tom, Tommy, Fresh, whatever you guys want to call me. And I'm joined by a bud of mine again, Mr. Drew Cordell. How you doing, buddy?
Hey Tommy, doing well. How are you doing?
I'm hanging in, man. It's crazy time of year. We're glad we got into 2022, and we got some fun stuff in Flesh and Blood coming up this year that I'm pretty stoked about. How about you?
Absolutely, yeah. It's set to be a really exciting year, especially with Everfest right around the corner.
Definitely. Now, what have you been up to in the world of Flesh and Blood?
After November and a lot of the organized play, I really took quite a nice break from really the content creation and playing on the competitive level, but I'm extremely recharged and refreshed, ready to jump back in 2022, keep staying involved with all the competitive things in Flesh and Blood and hit the ground running.
Yeah, it's kind of nice. It seems maybe unique to Flesh and Blood that we kind of get that little bit of a break, in between like the skirmish season and now, that we can kind of really, for content creation it can be tough, but we can all make it work. But like for us as players and stuff, we can really definitely, get in a good mindset, and it makes us really miss the game. That's what I found.
Yeah, for sure. I found I was really ready to come back after the month and a half or so off from playing events.
Yeah. Now, did you play in any skirmish events when those were going on?
Yeah, I did a few skirmishes, mostly playing Oldham, and for the most part went pretty well. One of those events that I was really excited for actually paired up against a Bravo who was running the red version of Stonewall Confidence in the main list, unironically. So, needless to say, that game was a draw.
Oh my God. Yeah, I can imagine. That's crazy. Now, how do you like the Oldham versus Bravo matchup?
I like it a lot. It's quite skill intensive. It's less grindy than you would think. It's not as grindy as something like Oldham v Oldham or Bravo v Bravo, but there's a lot of room for skill and some cool interactions in there where you're going back and forth and trying to threaten. Really, one of the most efficient things against Bravo is the frostbite and the threat of that resource tax there, since all of his abilities are so costly in cards.
Absolutely. Now, yeah, that seems like a fun matchup. It seems like who can get in the most beaters and kind of tax the other first, I guess, is probably seems like how it would go, but I have to play it a little bit more. Now, are there any decks that you've been playing or brewing, in 2022 that you're excited about?
Yeah, I've really been switching kind of back and forth between Oldham and Bravo. And Oldham, I've been experimenting with Enlightened Strike, just as kind of a go wide mechanism and also just a heavy beater when you need it to be. But excuse me, excited to continue to just explore Guardian and maybe some other classes too when we get some of the Everfest spoilers coming up.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Enlightened Strike was in the list that won the calling in Orlando, if I remember correctly. Now, when you came on last time, we were talking Oldham. This is when Tales of Aria was pretty fresh, and it wasn't in the list at the time. How do you like when you first saw Enlightened Strike in Oldham lists? What kind of went through your mind? Was that something you had already thought about, or was this something that kind of was new to you?
Yeah, some of my earliest versions of Oldham, I was really hyper focused on making a deck that was playable against Prism, and that's kind of the story of Guardian in general. Is that's been an extremely challenging matchup, but with the rise of Briar in the mix, Briar is extremely efficient against Prism players, so there's a lot less Prism running around these days, and that really opened up a lot of deck building possibilities for Oldham, and that's kind of where the Enlightened Strike comes into play. I'd maybe been too quick to discount that when I was first experimenting with the list, as my earlier versions were extremely control heavy and didn't always attempt to grab the tempo like that in ways that Enlightened Strike can enable.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, so you've been playing around with Bravo and Oldham Guardian. You're the Guardian guy, as they say. Uh, any plans for participating in the organized play in 2022? I mean, it looks like we're gonna have a ProQuest season coming up. We have, ideally a Pro Tour with the ProQuests, and then some callings, I imagine, coming up soon as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna be playing as many events as I can, just really taking a data-oriented approach to deck building and discovering the matchups. And I'm really excited to see how Everfest changes things since it's a supplemental set and may enable some really cool new strategies for a variety of decks. So I'm definitely excited to jump back in and play all the organized play I can in 2022.
Now, what are some decks? Like, obviously, right now, Briar's the word, right? Everybody's talking about Briar. Everybody's talking, you're either playing Briar or you're trying to beat Briar, or you kind of try to hope to beat the decks that are trying to beat Briar. It's the nice rock, paper, scissors. Now, what are some decks in the meta right now as it stands before Everfest that you've been impressed with, in this Briar run world?
It's honestly Oldham and Briar themselves. Oldham is extremely powerful, but the challenge, of course, is that it feels like you're facing the clock just as much as you are your opponent. And
Mm-hmm.
even with the just really trying to speed up interactions and the physical manipulation of the cards while you're piloting the deck, it can be a challenge. So I'm really kind of hoping with Everfest that we get a little more variety in the meta game. It's closed up a little bit more compared to where it's been in previous sets, where there's not as many tier 1 or tier 0 decks that are super competitive or viable at the top levels. But I've been pretty impressed with everything in general, and just looking forward to the meta freshening up a little bit as we approach Everfest.
Absolutely. Now, who or which hero would you say has the most to gain from Everfest? We've talked about heroes that are obviously up at the top right now. Now, there are obviously other heroes that really aren't seeing the amount of play that some people would like. Personally, I'm a big Levia player, and I would love to see some support for Levia. Though we've seen some success here and there with Levia.
Definitely. I think really mechanologist could use some help. It's one of the most underrepresented classes currently, just in both the meta and the card pool currently. So, really, I would like to see some cool new mechanologist stuff that maybe would incentivize playing that deck a little bit more and maybe open up some lines. But I'm with you on Levi as well. As I played that deck a lot in early Monarch season for Blitz. Never got around to really attempting to build something that would do well in Classic Constructed. But as a Blitz deck, it was a ton of fun.
Yeah, she's great. She's great. And actually, by the time this episode's out, I'll have a video out on YouTube talking about some Levia, but I'll plug that at the end. Now let's get to a crack a pack before we get to our main topic. I have a pack of Welcome to Wraith Unlimited, not Alpha, unfortunately. uh, now I did a draft of Welcome to Wrath for the first time the other day, kind of in preparation for the farewell to Welcome to Wraith or Wrath at the end of the month. It was my first time. It was a lot of fun. I drafted Rhinar. Have you had any experience drafting Welcome to Wraith? Wraith?
Yeah, it's a ton of fun to draft that set, and it's one I've played quite a lot. And naturally, I tend to go Bravo where I can, but any of the classes in that set are super viable, and it's always fun, even as Katsu, just to throw the Kodachis across the table every turn.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. I was really impressed with how viable each hero was while playing. Um, I was obviously Rhinar. I was very lucky. I got past like sixth pick Reckless Swing when I was already in Rhinar, And I was like, oh, well, I think the deck's a little open. So I took that and I won 2 games in a row with it. And, there was no small amount of salts with that, but, what can you do? But I was also really impressed with Dorinthia. Very, very, scary deck to play against
Definitely.
in constructed and in draft, it turns out. So first out of the pack is Red Raging Onslaught. This is the 3-cost 7 generic attack action with 3 defense. How do you feel
Yep,
about
you
that
need a
card?
beater. That's the one.
Oh yeah, that's a big one. Uh, Now, how do you like the rate? And we'll probably get to this later, but how do you like the rate of 3 for 7?
It's pretty efficient, especially if you have enough blues to back it. That's just a beefy attack. It's got that break point of 7, so it's gonna break past 2 cards defending from hand, plus maybe a point of armor or life. So it's just if you need a big attack, you want to hold the tempo or get it back. That you can't really go wrong with something like that. I wouldn't want a ton in my deck, but just as a 1 or 2 of, it's not bad at all.
Nice. Now, next we have Wounding or Wounding? No, Wounding Blow. Yellow. This is 0 cost, 3 attack, 3 defense.
Yeah, that for especially in the yellow slot, that's going to be more filler than anything else. But
Yeah.
if you need it, you need it.
I guess at the red, 0 for 4 is pretty strong.
Yeah,
Um,
we'll probably touch on it a little bit later. But for attacks, there is the something called the rule of 8,
mm-hmm.
and that's kind of going to give you a guideline for how LSS has structured all the attacks in terms of their efficiency, for cost, and all of that. So I'm sure we'll touch on that a
Yeah,
little
we'll
bit later.
touch on that. Next we have Blue Sink Below. I'm not really high on the blue one. I guess if you need a blue, it's not the worst. It defends for 2, and then you can sink a card from your hand uh, into your deck and draw.
Yeah, preferably that'd be one I'd try to avoid in the list, just
Yeah.
because it does not defend well enough at all.
No. Here's a card I do like, actually, better than Raging Onslaught. Red Barraging Brawnhide, which is 3 costs and attacks for 7. Defends for 1 less, but if it's defended by less than 2 non-equipment cards, it gets +1.
Yeah, definitely a strong beater.
Played quite a bit of it in that Reinar deck. We have an equipment. Iron Rot Gauntlet. Seems to be a premium in the format.
Definitely. Any kind of equipment in draft is usually a little bit higher up on the pick list there.
For sure. Then we got our first rare. Uh, Now this is a good one. This is a Guardian action. Aura, Blessing of Deliverance. This is the red one. 2 cost. 3 defense for 3. Has go again when it enters the arena. If you have a card with cost 3 or greater in your pitch zone, draw a card. At the beginning of your action phase, destroy Blessing of Deliverance. Then reveal the top 3 cards of your deck. Gain 1 for each card with cost 3 or greater revealed this way.
Definitely a great card and one of my favorites. And draft format, since you usually will not have access to tectonic plating, it's fantastic to enable Anethos swinging for 6, pitching 2, 3 or greater cost cards, and gaining some life, drawing a card, and hopefully being able to do something cool with your last floating resource there.
Yeah, it seems to be kind of what really would bring a Bravo deck together in this format.
Definitely. And the red one tends to be a little more control oriented, where you're going to be able to gain that life, take a hit later, or just keep your life total high. And typically the blue one's a little more aggressive, but in draft,
Mm-hmm.
I'd certainly look to include all of them, including the yellows, wherever possible.
Now we do have a Majestic. This is a card I play quite a bit of in Constructed. It is Bloodrush Bellow. It is a 1 cost, brute action, 3 defense. Has additional cost to play Bloodrush Bellow, discard a card at random. Your brute attacks gain +2 this turn. If you discarded a 6 or more attack, draw 2 cards, and Bloodrush Bellow gains go again.
Yeah, just an extremely powerful card, and one of the reasons you'd want to play brute. And draft and limited, especially if you can back that with enough 6 power cards, it's going to be extremely powerful and impactful almost every time you play it.
Now you open that pack one, you look at it. Is this something? Because typically staying open a little bit is good. Is this something that you would say, you know what? If I get on this early and start drafting some 6 powers now, is it worth it?
I would certainly take that as my first pick for that pack, even if it is pack one,
Mm-hmm.
just because that's a card you can really build your entire deck and strategy around. And typically you'll be able to, if you need to make the pivot, it's still early enough to where for the remainder of that round in that pack, you can just look to draft some powerful generics that are going to slot into any deck, but you have that option to build around that card as kind of the foundation or pillar of the deck.
Absolutely. Now we have a foil. Blue Savage Feast is the 1 cost, 4 attack, 3 defense, brute attack action. Additional cost to play Savage Feast. Discard a card at random. When you attack with Savage Feast, if a 6 or more was discarded, draw a card.
Yeah, certainly not the best, but also it blocks for 3 and pitches for 3. So if you need just more resources in the deck and something that you can reasonably attack with and not feel too bad about it, it's not a bad choice.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's it seems like kind of I would pick it up later. I don't think I would this early. But you know, the red one excellent for the deck it seems. Um we have a blue Savage Swing, 1 cost, 5 attack, 3 defense. Additional cost, discard a card at random. I think
Yeah,
I'm
not
more on
too
the
bad.
yeah, yeah. Not. I mean, I think I'm a little more in the yellow and the red, obviously, but
Uh-huh.
you know the rate on the blue one is still pretty good. And we have leg tap, ninja action, 1 cost, 4 attack, 2 defense. Go again.
That's certainly a powerful card, especially with the 4 breakpoint there and just low resource cost and comes in for a lot for the
Uh,
cost.
oh yeah, oh yeah. Next we have buckling blow. This is the yellow one, cost 4, 7 attack, 3 defense. Crush if it deals 4 or more damage to a hero. Put a -1. Um, I guess what they defense counter on target equipment they control.
Yeah, buckling blow is one that's usually used in constructed in the blue slot just for either blocking 3 or pitching for resources, but it can be reasonable and limited. It's just you've got to understand you're normally not going to get a ton of value off of that card text there, as usually opponents won't have a full set of equipment or maybe not even a target at that point of the game where you actually want to be playing that in either yellow or blue.
Mm-hmm.
For red, it's a little more flexible.
Yeah. It seems like maybe if you're on Bravo, that's like kind of your like 25th through 30th card maybe edition. Um, Next we got Biting Blade Blue, 2 costs, target weapon attack gains +1, has reprise if defending hero is defended with a card from their hand. This chain link weapons you control gain +1 until end of turn, and it has 3 defense.
Yeah, very strong card for Dorinthia, especially in the blue slot, as that's one that's going to gain a lot of value later in the game if you still have sources that go again, or just having the ability to defend or pitch for 3 resources. Always commands a premium.
Yeah. Though you got to be, I guess, it seems like all the attack reactions seems, for the most part, pretty great for Dorinthia. But you know, if multiple people are vying for it, it could be tough. Uh, Next we have Primeval Bellow Red. I like this card quite a bit. 0 cost, brute action. There's additional cost to play it. Discard a card at random. Your next brute attack this turn gains +5. Go again.
Yeah, it's just a extremely fun card to play and very powerful for Brute.
Yeah, and I do like that it is brute attack. So you know, if the discard doesn't go your way, you can come in with the the Romping Club, not the Meat Axe in this set. So next we got Surging Strike Yellow, 2 for 4 attack, 2 defense. Go again. Ninja action.
Yeah, certainly a reasonable card if you're looking for either combo or just to pad the deck a little bit with yellows and resource generation there.
Absolutely. And the last card is Blue Emerging Power. 2 cost, Guardian Action Aura, 3 defense. As go again. At the beginning of your action phase, destroy it, and your next Guardian attack action card you play gains +1.
Yeah, this is one I'd try to avoid at almost all costs. It's just not a good card. We got Emerging Dominance in Crucible, which is a much more reasonable choice since it adds the Dominate on top. But yeah, this is one I try to avoid if possible.
Yeah, it's just the rate isn't that great, and it's not like in Tails where maybe you're getting a thump dominated, you know, so not the best. But I think we're on Bloodrush Bellow, right? On that one.
Yes,
Yeah.
that would be my first pick.
Cool, cool. Now those are all going to go in the giveaway pile, which I'll be announcing soon. Now let's get to the main topic. I wanted to have you on, Drew, because you are quite the expert in strategy, and you really have a great knowledge of the game and how it works, and I wanted to talk about like how can we freshen up the game of the listeners, and you know, and I wanted to kind of go through like 4 or so categories. So the first category is card evaluation. It's kind of like what makes a card good. See, when I first started playing the game, card evaluation is probably the hardest for me, right? Like, is this card good or is it bad? You know, like what makes it good, what makes it bad. So like, first, let's talk about attacks. What is a good attack rate per resource cost? Like, what's like the vanilla test in Flesh and Blood, you would say?
Sure. So LSS actually has this baked into the design, and they don't really deviate from it. In attacks, they have what's called the rule of 8. And they may not officially call it this, but you can take any attack in the game. You add up the attack value, what it defends for, and the pitch value of that card, and then you subtract the resource cost. Do that with almost any attack, and it's that equation is going to equal 8. Now, where they get a little bit more creative and the value or the ratio there is the text of the card. It's a little bit more difficult to quantify certain effects, especially if they're not numerical. If
Mm-hmm.
they're doing something, that's really where the card is going to improve and where it can become more powerful. For example, a card may have go again, it'll still follow that rule of 8, but then you've got an opportunity to follow up with that attack and put some more pressure on your opponent.
So, go again on a card that theoretically adds up to 8 is above rate, you would say.
It certainly depends on the card itself.
Mm-hmm.
Usually, every attack is going to follow that rule, but it's up to the players to determine the value of the additional text on the cards. And in general, I think LSS does a really good job of balancing this. Kind of one of the fringe cases where it might be overtuned is Command and Conquer. You're
Yeah.
getting 2 extremely relevant lines of text. Everything still adds up to 8 with that formula, but I think we can all agree it's just an extremely powerful card for what it is.
I would say so. The card's pretty pretty intense. Now, but though I would say initially, I think a lot of players do come to the game. They look at a card like Command and Conquer, and they go, "Well, why is this, in every deck? Why is this 80 some odd dollars? Whatever it was. I don't even know what it is now, but like." That one is probably the real test to really like, I guess, tell a player whether they know if they're evaluating cards correctly.
Yeah, and it's really quite a controversial card, and it's doing a lot uh, outside of just attacking for 6, which by itself that represents half of your opponent's hand if they want to full block it without
Mm-hmm.
armor or defense reaction. So one of the strongest things this card does is it turns your opponent's defense reactions into a liability. They don't want to have those whenever you're threatening this card, and
Mm-hmm.
they become extremely bad and or dead when facing this down. on the other side of things, the second line there, this is one of the only cards in the game that attacks your opponent on a separate axis. It's able to attack their arsenal, which in Flesh and Blood is one of the only sources of true card advantage that you can generate. By deferring that card from a previous turn, you're hoping to create incremental advantages and do something more powerful than would be possible with just a 4 card hand. So that's really where Command and Conquer gets a lot of its additional strength.
Now, so you say Command and Conquer is a good example of kind of a pushed rate. Now, what would you say is a card that is at a good rate, but not pushed? Is there any attack that you would think that we see play that's like, all right, well, this makes sense. This is you're working for it with the cost or even the resource value. Are there any cards like that?
That's going to be most of your class cards. There's some that are completely reasonable. Really, where we see a lot of the push outside of Command and Conquer is with some of those specialization attacks for classes. Those kind of bend the rule a little bit in that they usually have some very powerful text because it's the hero signature move. It's
Mm-hmm.
when you play that card, it really just kind of resonates with the player with the thematic nature of playing it and how it feels to play the card against your opponent. Like you feel like you're shooting an arrow or swinging a big hammer, whatever the specialization card is doing, it's always very impactful. But outside of that, really, it's most attacks, just the way that they're balanced. I think LSS does a really good job of making almost everything reasonable. And just with the resource pitch system we have and having the different colors, you can really tweak your ratios and what you're doing in your deck to have something that could be better for generating resources, attacking, or if a yellow makes sense, you can go the in between route. So
Mm-hmm.
that's really one of the things I really like about the game and how I kind of view LSS's design and the balance that they put in place.
I think I think maybe it was LSV who said that the game is designed with great intent, right? Their intent when sitting down and designing this game is has been really incredible. Now, I guess non-attacks can also be a little bit tough to evaluate. What I guess you could kind of loop non-attacks and instance to a certain extent in the same category because they're going to have like a just an effect without an attack. What are some effects that we like to see? What are some effects that we don't like to see when we sit down and look at a non-attack or an instant?
Yeah, that's really quite an interesting topic, and it kind of depends on a card by card basis. I guess some of the ones that I'd like to see, typically things that improve the attack power outside of maybe attack reactions.
Mm-hmm.
And while those cards will telegraph that you're going to be coming in for a big attack, your opponent's still going to have to deal with that attack if they can't pressure you enough to take cards out of your hand and really take the steam out of it. But on the other hand, there are a lot of effects that I would try to avoid, and so something like if we look at Tales of Aria, Inspire Lightning,
Mm-hmm.
which you just play it. If you fuse it, it does arcane damage. Probably one of the worst cards ever printed in the game, and one that I would strongly avoid, even though I actually lost a match at the Calling DFW to that card and the Briar Mirror. And it was kind of ironic because I always say it's so bad, but even looking back at that, I still wouldn't include it in my deck.
I mean, yeah, I was about to say. I mean, I've lost to that card more times than I care to admit. I do agree. I do agree that that card is not good. I wouldn't say the worst. I wouldn't say the worst card because I've seen some people go off with Vila Flash in that card, and I've said, realized, okay, maybe you could do it, but
Uh,
yeah. Now, uh, so that's an effect that you don't like. Well, that's a good example of a card that requires a lot to make work, right? You need a
Definitely.
lot of moving pieces. Now, I guess some great non-attacks and instants that instants, obviously are a little bit more rare in the game, but non-attacks that you see in played and constructed usually uh, set you down the path to making your synergy and theme work of the hero deck. Things that make rune chants for Viscerai, or things that you can play out of your banish zone in chain. I don't know why I'm picking all rune blades. It's just on my mind, but things like that. Am I far off with that, Drew?
No, that's totally correct. And like, I hate to keep going back to Guardian, but with like Oldhim, for example, you've got Channel Lake Frigid, which is going to tax everything your opponent does. I
Mm-hmm.
think LSS has done a really good job of tying a lot of the thematics of the different classes to some of these non-attack actions, to the point where there are quite a few that are very powerful, especially those ones that have Go Again, that let you play that card and then potentially attack as well on the same turn, either with a attack action card or just your weapon. So that's one of the strong design points, and really where you can get a lot of synergy from some of those non-attack actions.
Absolutely, and I guess it's speaking of Guardian. I wanted to tell you that I was at Orlando playing in a side event, like a classic constructor. I was playing Oldhim, the list that we had talked about, and I got to play against Chain. Came down to the last turn, had no cards left in their deck, and I played a Blizzard. That's a great instant against them. It felt really good.
Oh yeah, Blizzard's great.
That might be. It has to be one of the most satisfying cards to play, an instant to play that can totally disrupt someone's turn. I think I'm big. I'm pretty high on Blizzard.
Yeah, for sure. That's a really strong card, and usually, no matter when you draw it, if it's a match that it's going to be relevant, you're going to be happy playing that card.
Absolutely. Now, defense reactions and attack reactions. So I would say, from what I can gather in card evaluation, you look at a defense reaction. So it has to do more than just block for 3, right? That's what all your other cards that do things throughout the game do anyway. So you look at like Sink Below Red is above rate on that. It's like cost 0 and blocks 4 instead of your 3, or same with Fate Foreseen. Um, what are some general rules of thumb on defense and attack reactions?
Yeah, so typically there's a few different routes with the defense reactions, but what you're looking for is typically a card that's going to defend for more than 3. And thankfully, most of the defense reactions you'll find will do that. In general, it's more efficient to defend in Flesh and Blood than it is to attack, just because you're usually not paying those costs unless it's associated with the defense reaction. But what you do get is the trade off there, since the defense reaction can't be played for anything other than defending.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to do its job really well and just going to provide it really a buffer zone where you can protect yourself against what your opponent's doing and hopefully counterattack next turn, because you don't have to spend as many cards or resources defending against their attack.
And for attack reactions, we see, I would say, relatively outside of certain decks, a lower amount of attack reactions played and constructed. Uh, so I would have to say that the rate has to be pretty high to be playable.
Yeah, and these are really a lot of these attack reactions are going to have additional effects baked in, like Pummel and Razor Reflex, for example, those generic ones that you're either going to force a discard or give some additional effect. But really, outside of Warrior, which really likes to use attack reactions just as a
Mm-hmm.
way to build on the reprise mechanic and punish your opponent for blocking their attacks, they are a little more underrepresented compared to defense reactions in a lot of decks that aren't hyper aggressive.
Absolutely. Now, equipment. So when you sit down and look at equipment, especially new equipment, mm, I guess there's two things you can really look at. It's defense value and its utility. I think general thumb, two with Battle Worn is great defense, right? Blocks for a total of 3. And then utility, I mean, that can range anywhere.
Definitely. And that goes kind of along the evaluation things we talked about, where some of the utility pieces are a little bit harder to quantify, but thankfully, a lot of the legendary equipment for classes will have a great combination of both. And especially some of the bulkier classes will have gear that generates some good utility, but then also defends for well above average, usually 3 or greater, just depending on the piece.
Mm-hmm. Now, what would you say is the gold standard generic helmet? Is that
Well,
a
that's got to be Arcanine Skull Cap there. It's just blocking for 3 in your head slot is extremely powerful. So, any other equipment, if you're going to slot that into the headpiece for a class, you're going to want to have that. So that's a ton of extra life, especially in Blitz, where you start with half of what you would in CC.
now I would say Arcanine Skull Cap is also another I guess controversial card in the game. I mean, maybe that falls on its price, and we're getting a reprint of it in EVR, which is awesome. But it we don't see a lot of really defensive headpieces. It's do you think it should have been maybe a little less powerful, or what do you think it's totally fair?
I think it's fairly reasonable, especially with the stipulation that it's only going to have that +1 defense while you're on lower life total. So you
Mm-hmm.
kind of have to be more mindful with how you block and take damage when trying to get the most value out of that. And your opponent definitely has some opportunities when they're threatening things like on hit effects to really try to incentivize you to not get that additional block and to block too early to the point where you're going to block for 2 instead of 3 with the helmet. And then at that point, it's a lot more toned down. So
Mm-hmm.
I think with the counterplay and just having to be extremely mindful with your own play when using the helmet and when you take damage and lose life, that it kind of balances out. Though I certainly understand it is one of the, if not the strongest headpiece for most decks right now.
Yeah, yeah, and you always have that fail safe of playing it if you run into a Kano, right? Though you can't use it until they deal some damage to you because they start lower, which is like kind of funny. But let's move on to combat. Combat can be difficult for a lot of people when they first start playing. At making decisions in attacks and blocks, I see it all the time. People over blocking or under blocking or stuff like that. So what decisions are critical in choosing your attacks and blocks, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's really one of the more complicated topics in Flesh and Blood, and it's really going to depend on what you're trying to do with your deck and what your opponent's trying to do at the same time. What cards you've already played that are powerful and what cards your opponent have already played that are powerful. So sometimes you'll want to play around certain things you think your opponent's going to do. Other times you want to, if you have the tempo, for example, you really want to continue the pressure and maybe overextend to a certain extent just to continue down that path and hopefully try to get to a place where you can build up an advantage. But when I'm trying to choose attacks and blocks, I'm always looking at that with a mindset of, okay, here's how much damage I want to take on this turn. Here's how much I think I can swing back. It's partly a guessing game where you have to
Mm.
decide if what you're threatening is more powerful than what your opponent's threatening. Because you don't want to be in a position where you say, okay, this is really cool. I'm going to do this huge attack with all 4 cards. I'm going to swing for 12. And what your opponent does is they come in with something like, let's just say they swing for 8. And you say, okay, I want to keep these 4 cards. So you take the 8 damage. And the next turn, when you swing for 12, your opponent just full blocks you and they don't take any damage. They're not going to do anything with their next turn, but then if you don't draw something powerful to follow it up, you're just down 8 life, and they're going to have an opportunity to maybe take 4, take 6 damage, whatever, come back with something powerful, regain the tempo, and then you're just down life. So There's always it's a continuous evaluation process, and it's one that's going to differ from class to class, deck to deck, and player to player.
Yeah, I guess a big part of that is understanding uh all I mean, you have to understand the hero you're playing against, what they're trying to do for sure. You need to know what their plan is, especially when making these decisions. And it can be it's really hard. I agree and you know, I think maybe a you know, something for beginners and whatnot I would like to tell people is like look at your hand, decide what you want to do next turn on your turn, and then decide how much damage you can afford to take and move on from there. So another thing that can be tough in combat is your turn and like attack sequencing. Are there like some good rules of thumb here? Because I know that you know I see it all the time. Even and I used to do it, and sometimes still do. You kind of you play out your turn. You're like, all right, well, I just sequenced that completely incorrectly, and I can't do what I want to do. Are there any kind of like tips and tricks that you can kind of try to remember and when looking at your hand and deciding how you're going to play out your turn?
Yeah, for sure. Really, it's simple and on paper, but when you get into execution, it gets a little bit more complicated. But it is something you can practice, and that's you when you're sequencing your turn. You want to try to be as efficient with your resources as possible while making your opponent's life as complicated as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So usually what that looks like is, let's say I have an attack with 4 and go again. So I swing that in. That's already a little awkward for the opponent because of that break point. Most of their cards are going to defend for 3. So right off the bat, I've pitched a blue. I've attacked with 4. Go again for, let's say it costs 1 resource. I have 2 resources floating. So now they're facing both that break point and the threat of attack reactions with those 2 floating resources and potentially another attack. So they're going to already have 2 different decisions there. How they want to block that, and do they think that I have an attack reaction? And
Mm-hmm.
from there, you just want to try to layer on the pressure and make their decisions complicated. If it looks like let's say for last turn, for example, they took a lot of damage to keep 4 or 5 cards, you can expect they're going to try to do something powerful. So on those turns, you really just want to pressure as much as possible, generate the most damage output you can with the hand you have, and just try to be efficient in your play. Those are just some general tips I have for that area of the game.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Now you mentioned you know them an opponent taking a ton of damage, not blocking, keeping the 4 cards. When should you decide to do that? Like when not to block? You know, like how do you kind of judge how powerful your hand is? I guess is there anything that you can really, I guess, quantify in terms when that, or you just kind of have to decide based on your deck and the game state as it is.
It's really going to be quite fluid, but if you're playing a deck that has a powerful combo, for example, and you've been working toward playing that combo itself, so with Dorinthia, for example, that would be comboing off some of your power cards like Iron Song Determination,
Mm-hmm.
Steel Blade Supremacy, things like that. If you're on Guardian, that's your Crippling Crush dominated turn, and things like that. So really, those powerful attacks and abilities. If you have any kind of evasion where you're going to be able to get around or make it more difficult for your opponent to block, or you're really threatening some nasty on-hit effects, that's when it can be worth taking a hit. As long as you're not too worried about any specific card or being at a low life total to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great rule of thumb there. Now you did mention tempo. Tempo could be a lot different in a lot of different games. What is tempo in Flesh and Blood? How would you just define tempo for Flesh and Blood?
In Flesh and Blood, it's a little more complicated, but the basic essence is who is generating the most pressure in that moment in the game.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really between your life total and your cards and hands. That's going to be when it's determined, as well as your armor. So if you have the tempo, typically you're hitting your opponent just turn after turn with a big beater, coming in for anywhere from 8 to 10 damage on the turn. Your opponent just keeps blocking. Maybe they're keeping one card in hand to swing their weapon back at you, but for the most part, you're just generating a lot more damage than they are at that time. So when we look at tempo and then how to maybe reacquire it if you've lost it, or seize it, take it from the beginning and hold on to it, that's really where your life total and your armor are going to come into play.
Mm-hmm. Now, so that's how you kind of recognize tempo, right? You're hitting, you're beating in, and they're blocking a lot, and they're not really being able to match your aggression. Um, I think it's important for people to recognize that. Sometimes I've seen players kind of have the tempo, and then for some reason take a turn off to be a little more defensive, which it is what it is. Sometimes it happens, but um, you just have to really recognize that. Hey, listen, I'm the one in control of this game. So now you can lose tempo. We lose tempo all the time. It happens in games all the time. What are ways we can regain the tempo?
Yeah, typically to regain, you either need your opponent to have an off turn, like you just said. Sometimes you just don't have the cards to generate the pressure, or maybe they decide to take a defensive turn. Usually that won't happen in higher levels of play unless they really just don't have the cards to generate a substantial threat that turn. But the best, most reliable way to regain the tempo if you've lost it is to take damage or to
Mm-hmm.
stop it with your armor. And in Flesh and Blood, especially just with the nature of how the combat works in the system, if you do not block with a card from your hand, you're going to get that card to do something on your turn. So really, it's just as important when you want to regain the tempo as it is that you have the resources, either life or armor, to do that. But in general, that means you're going to take a pretty big hit.
Yeah, and that goes back to what we were talking about, like when not to block. You have to recognize your really strong hands, right? You have to recognize when you're going to be able to really to smash them back. So yeah, so that's tempo. Tempo is really important. It swings a lot in Flesh and Blood. But it is one of my most one of the most fun things to learn. I think in Flesh and Blood. Now, the last kind of level up thing here I wanted to talk about is being flexible. This is something that uh, I'm a big proponent of. I don't know how you feel about it, Drew, but I think every hero has a game plan, and it is important to stick to that plan. And however, you got to be flexible in certain matchups against certain play styles and certain players. For example, this happened at a skirmish. It was a draft skirmish. I had drafted Oldham, and I was against Breyer, against a really good player, a well-known player. And, I got the dream. I was on, he let me be on the play. And I was able to come in with red Glacial Footsteps. Not fused, but I smashed in for 10 the first turn. And he looked at his hand, and I guess he might have wanted to keep something in there, and he didn't full block it. He let 10 go through, which, I guess he decided it's like, oh, well, I'll just regain the tempo because of that. And I think when I saw that, I was like, well, I just have to keep being the aggressor here. Though typically in Oldham, he likes to block a lot, and then you just come in with a hammer. You have to recognize when to do that. So I remember I beat him, and he was talking to his friend. He's like, well, he wasn't supposed to play that way. Like he's talking about me. I was like, well, I mean, I didn't say it to him because he was having a separate conversation. I was like, well, I recognize that, you're letting me be the aggressor. So I had
Uh,
to just be it. Now, is this something that you found in Flesh and Blood? The important
oh,
flexibility?
absolutely. I think it's really something that impacts players on even a turn by turn basis. You're always looking at your hand, what you want to do, and trying to determine what's the best approach there. And then from there you go, okay, well, what's my best route here? If I have to block with a card, how about two cards? What if I can only keep one card? And so you always want to be flexible with the understanding that you're going to have to interact with what your opponent's doing. And the example of taking 10 there, like that's just insane. But
Yeah, I mean,
especially on the first.
I don't know
Thing.
why he did it. I don't. I mean, he did have a great turn, right? I will say his follow up turn was really good. However, I I could. I mean, like Oldham's just gonna have better attacks, like the bigger attacks to come back at him. So I just like, well, I'll take most of that. I think I blocked the one card the following turn, and then it was like, all right, well, right back at you with like 8 or 9. So
Yeah,
yeah, it was an interesting decision. I think he was being a little bit too risky, but it is what it is.
sure. Yeah, but really, just with the flexibility there, it's Flesh and Blood. Like a lot of other games, it's really a battle of ideas between you and your opponent, and you're both trying to come up with new ideas to react on the fly, be flexible in your game plan, and look for ways kind of to poke your opponent, play around what they're doing, and just really search for those winning lines that are going to help you win.
Yeah, and I even sometimes flexibility can come down to your sideboard. You have to be flexible against heroes like Katsu and Dash because you don't know what version they're playing, right? Um, so you gotta, I guess, hedge the your sideboard in a way so that you're not exactly committing to the aggro or the control or even mid range in some cases.
Definitely. And that's something I found in Guardian as well, especially in the mirror matches. If it's going to be control v control, typically you want to board in a way in Classic Constructed where you're going to shift to more of a mid range and proactive strategy for the deck. Really just focus less on the defense and more about just generating consistent and reliable pressure along the way. So there's a lot of that flexibility in what you see and how you tune the deck for certain matchups based on what's in the sideboard and how your full list of 80s built there.
Now, in an aggro versus aggro matchup, do you find that the because I think something with like maybe like this red line Briar deck that's come about, it seems to kind of be like take damage, pass turn, take damage, and there's not a whole lot of blocking going on. But I think in traditional aggro is you gotta be flexible and be ready to play defense. Like it's not always a race, right?
Yeah, for sure. It's really gonna differ from deck to deck. And with Briar, a little bit of that race for damage comes in her ability that can generate those tokens that will give your non-attack action cards an additional blocking power. So you're basically going, okay, if I hit you enough, if I push enough damage here, I can just block with one card from my hand and stop 5 or 6 damage, and basically just get a better Sink Below or Fate Foreseen off of just a non-attack action that would ordinarily only block for 3.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, so those are some things that you can kind of take in and use to freshen up your flesh and blood game. Now, I got a question for you, Drew. Um, Briar is Briar the word? Is Briar really the word going into Everfest, or do you really believe that Oldham is really the word going into, because I know you're big on Oldham, but it's tough because Oldham can have some bad matchups.
Yeah, for sure. Briar is the deck to beat right now, and I'm hoping with Everfest we'll get a little bit of shakeup in the formats and hopefully get some more variety in the metagame.
Absolutely, yeah, I agree. I mean, I think we will. With the them saying that each hero is going to get some support, which is awesome. Hopefully it's each hero and not each class. Well, I guess each class would be fine too. But obviously I want something for Levia. But do you have anything to plug before we go, Drew?
Yeah, I'll have a ton of content coming out on Wraith Times, and also the creator of that just launched Techlo Labs, which is in beta testing right now, but that's going to be a really cool analytical and database platform that's going to pull data from both FaB TCG's official deck lists that are posted there as well as FabDB, but it just gives some cool insights. So, for example, you could go into a certain class, see what cards are most frequently played for that class across all of the decks, the percentages and all that, and just get really an additional tool to pull some helpful metrics along the way. But should be a really exciting year for both Raid Times and all the other projects that Kirk has going on there.
Now that sounds pretty awesome. Are we able to see that now since it's in beta testing?
Yeah, yeah, it's open for anybody. So it's just called Techlo Labs. If you Google it, you'll be able to find it. I think there's also a link on FabDB to access that as well.
Cool, cool. I'll be sure to put that in the show notes. Some plugs for me are, hey, same thing as always. Twitter at FreshBudsPod. You can email the show freshbudspod@gmail.com. And I did start a YouTube show, I guess a little side show called The Fresh Five, where I talk about 5 things flesh and blood. I'm gonna try to do that every week, and people will see my ugly mug on YouTube. Now I like to talk about food every week. Mr. Cordell, what is some food that you want to talk about this week?
Yeah, so for New Year's Eve, my wife and I are going on our honeymoon soon. So we unfortunately made the call that we were going to cancel our party with friends. Just a grill out together, but I smoked a tomahawk steak and then some beef short rib and did like a Korean barbecue sauce on there. It was super delicious. So that's been my best food experience for the past month or so for sure.
Oh my god, that sounds so good. I just discovered a local barbecue joint. Now I'm in New Jersey. I'm not down in Texas, so like, it's not, people probably like, point their nose up at New Jersey barbecue, but I'm telling you, man, it's really legit. It's literally on the side of the road on this highway near me, and I had passed it a million times, and I always saw a ton of smokers outside, and it's just like a little hut, and I never went in, and I finally went there, and the guy's like just chilling there. I'm like, hey, he's like, can I get some food? He's like, yeah, and like I got some smoked jerk chicken, which was like out of this world, and it just fell right off the bone. Their mac and cheese is insane. Barbecue is amazing. Smoked meats are really the word. Briar's not the word. Smoked meats are the word. Damn it. So,
With you there.
but thanks again, Drew, for coming on. Your insights are always welcome here on Fresh and Buds. You are the man, and I hope that you have a great honeymoon. This will be out probably while you're on your honeymoon. So I hope you're having a great time. Then. Yeah, you have a good one.
Awesome. Thanks so much, man. Always a treat being on the show.
Awesome. And everybody have a great weekend. See you.